Okay, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this NYU Development Research Institute seminar with Michael Kremer and Jack Willis on converging to convergence. It's really a pleasure to have them here and to have all of you here, even if it's on Zoom and not in person. I hope someday soon we'll all be meeting in person. So let me start with a quick introduction of our two speakers. Jack Willis is Assistant Professor of Economics at Columbia University, my uptown neighbor. And Michael Kremer, someone I've known for a rather long time. I first met Michael, I think it was in the summer of 92 or 93, when we were working together on a paper that eventually came out in 93 called Good Policy or Good Luck. And that paper was joint with Lant Pritchett and Larry Summers. And Michael at that time was a summer intern at the World Bank while he was still a graduate student. And also another notable thing about that paper, we thanked a research assistant on that paper named Cheryl Sandberg. So I think this paper could go down in history as the one that had first the best research assistant of all time, and second, the best summer intern of all time, combined in one paper. So perhaps, Michael, you can add that to your best World Bank summer intern of all time. So Michael, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's great to come back to macro and growth, and great to be virtually here, yeah, look forward to connecting in person. So I'd like to talk about joint work with Jack Willis at Columbia and Yang Yu at Hong Kong University. Jack and I are going to be presenting jointly. I'll start. And the paper actually got its start from when I was teaching development economics at Harvard, and Jack was the teaching assistant. And I would tend to start this class with some facts, including facts on growth. And I drew on numerous examples from the empirical literature of the 1990s on growth, when there was just an explosion of empirical research on growth. And let me start, actually, before turning to this paper, with some facts that I used to teach. And these are, I think, well, when we go to the next slide, you'll see this chart, and this comes from Daron's textbook, and you see this type of chart, in many places, and this shows the annual growth rate against log GDP per worker in 1960. So the growth rate from 1960 to 2000, and you can see that there's very little relationship between initial incomes and growth. And in fact, if anything, looks like an upward sloping relationship, although really no significant relationship at all. And so based on this, Barrow, looking at similar evidence, wrote the hypothesis that poor countries grow faster than rich countries is inconsistent with cross-country evidence. And Lant Pritchett took this a step further and noted that if we look over a sufficiently large period of time, then there must have been divergence, because at some point, incomes were pretty equal around the world. We were all just very poor. So he shows that from 1870 to 1990, the ratio of per capita incomes between the richest and the poorest countries grew by a factor of 5. And it's some dispute about this, but people trace the beginning of the divergence back to the 16th century. So this pattern, or this failure to find convergence, is a challenge to some types of growth theory models. In particular, models that are where growth is based on accumulation of capital with decreasing returns, or models where copying technology is easier than developing it. And one response to the lack of convergence was AK endogenous growth models, so models where there's no decreasing returns to capital. And I note that those models actually predict divergence. And Romer's 1986 model can be seen as an example of that. There are other types of poverty trap models that could do this as well, but that was one response to this. But another response is models of conditional convergence. So these are models that are based on neoclassical growth models, in which there's convergence after you control for determinants of steady state income, things like human capital or policies or institutions. And a classic example of this was convergence within the OECD. So if you look in the 1960 to 2000 period, there's a lot of convergence within the OECD, and you might think these countries had relatively similar institutions. And Barrow talks about an iron law of 2% conditional convergence. If we go on to the next slide. In this paper, we're going to argue that this pattern may have changed. So if you look since the 2000s, so we're just breaking this up decade by decade, and if you look since the 2000s, so after the time that probably the best known empirical estimates of convergence were published, the convergence coefficient was 0.5% in 1960, so divergence. If you go back to the 1960s, you see it then flattens out. This may be a little bit of a wobble, but now it's negative 0.7%. And it's there's been some sense in which there's been convergence since we've been moving towards convergence over time, but with a little bit of an interruption in that. So let me say that maybe we should go on to the next slide, and I'll just give you a bit of a sense of where we're going. So I'll talk in more detail about convergence and income. Then we'll discuss convergence in the correlates of growth and income, the correlates that were identified in the 1990s literature, the correlates of growth from that. And then the final part of the talk will be linking convergence in income with convergence in the correlates. And so let me preview the findings a bit on the next slide. There's really been a trend towards income convergence since the 1990s. So we've started moving towards income convergence. I would have said since the 60s, but there is a decade that's not a monotonic trend. But we've actually gotten to overall convergence since 2000. We'll note that we'll show that the correlates of income also converge substantially, and they quote improved in the sense that a range of policies became more like those in rich countries. So that's true. We'll divide this up into a variety of types of correlates. Solow fundamentals, other policies like tariffs or institutions and culture. And the relationship between the correlates and income remain pretty stable, but they don't explain very much of the change in correlates. So the policies and institutions which were predictive before 1985 become less predictive afterwards. So what we see is, although the coefficients of growth regressions are pretty stable for Solow fundamentals, and they're somewhat stable for sort of long-run fixed correlates, there's very little autocorrelation for what we'll call short-run correlates, things like tariff policy, for example. And the coefficients have shrunk since 1990. So, why might that be? Well, one hypothesis would be that, the earlier growth regressions were an overfitting exercise. Obviously, there are lots of potential predictors of growth. Maybe we just overfit the data, and in fact, these policies were not related to growth. It's also possible that there was some change in the system. So, for example, tariff rates have come down around the world, and maybe the remaining differences in tariffs aren't so important, but the earlier differences were. But it's possible that with the fall of the Soviet Union and the adoption of Washington consensus type policies, that institutions have become much more similar, and policies become much less similar. And so the policy variables that we have and can measure are not as good measures of the remaining variation. But we'll also, in this decomposition issue exercise, show that sorry, can you go back 1 second? Has converged towards conditional convergence. So because we'll explain that more later on. Okay, why don't we go on ahead? Let me mention some of the literature that this is related to, and I'll highlight the ones that are in bold. So there's a large literature testing the neoclassical growth model. Let me focus on a few particular papers within that literature. So Greer and Greer argue that policy convergence means that the lack of income convergence is an even greater puzzle for the neoclassical growth model. And I think we agree with that pre-1990, particularly in the 1980s. But we look at what has changed since, and there we see things much more favorable to that model. There's this Johnson and Papageorgiou. Now they argue there's no real sign of convergence because they take the period as a whole, and they sort of think that the recent periods are an outlier. And I think that we're thinking of we agree that for much of the time since from 1960 to today, there hasn't been convergence, but we would tend to see the recent past, when there has been strong convergence, as part of a longer run trend towards convergence. Starting with the 60s when there was a lot of divergence, and then moving to now when there's a lot of convergence. Patel was done in parallel, and they also find recent convergence. Then let me turning to sort of the growth regression literature. Let me note Bill's paper, which I think is very much in line with our narrative. And it's clear that it's not pinning down a causal link, but there's a sort of story there that there was an improvement in policy since the 1990s associated with the Washington consensus. There's been improvement that those improvements in policy outcomes are correlated with investments in growth, and that growth has been good in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa since that period. But Bill, you may have a different take on that summary of some of your results.
You're doing great, Michael.
Okay, great, good to hear that. And Maislin's also a very related paper. And I hope we'll also connect to some of the literature on modern institutions, even and to older literature that goes back to sociology, from much older social thinkers, but it's very popular in the 50s, modernization theory, where income is actually driving changes in institutions and other social variables. Actually, that's not a very good summary of that literature. It sees this all as a package, sees them moving together. But in those theories, some of the policy improvements or quote improvements, I'm not making a welfare judgment, just whether they're correlated with growth. Some of those things might be caused in part by the growth in incomes. Okay, so why don't we, with that outline, let me start with just some more things on convergence and income. If you still have questions about, is that a fact? So we estimate this cross-country regression that you see. We're doing this mainly and with purchasing power parity, adjusted income from the Penn World tables. We're doing this slightly differently than you might normally see it. We're looking at the change in income from time t to the t plus 10, and that just, I think, makes it easier to interpret the graph rather than looking backwards. But you see this very strong trend towards convergence since 1985. And if we did this with constant US dollars, we'd see the trend since the 60s and 70s. And these are other papers. The other papers I mentioned, also talk about this. There's Arvind Subramaniam has a series of papers on related issues, and both this older paper and the newer paper that I mentioned, the Patel et al. Paper. Okay. Okay. Is this, we've seen growth, if you break this up by income level, you could say, is this about a slowdown at the frontier? Is it about faster catch-up growth? We do see that growth is increasing in the first through third quartiles from the early 80s till the 2000s, but it's been falling since. And we definitely do see the slowdown at the frontier, but as you can see from this, that's not doesn't fully explain the pattern. We don't see any evidence from this that sorts of one way to interpret the convergence in OECD, which was that once you got above a certain income of convergence, there was a convergence club's literature that once you got above a certain income, then you would start to converge. And we don't really see a whole lot of evidence for that pattern. So it's not like we think that the reason for this is that the world got above the threshold level of income at which convergence begins. That doesn't seem to be the story. Okay, consistent with what I was saying before, it was the richest countries that contribute the most to this recent convergence. Is the slowdown at the frontier, and then the poorest countries contribute the least. So there's a lot of growth in these sort of second and third quartiles, but the poorest countries are also not doing overwhelmingly well. So it's not catch up among the really poor. It doesn't look like, if we go to the next slide, it doesn't look like, if we exclude parts of the world, it doesn't look like that excluding any one part of the world makes these results go away. So when you exclude sub-Saharan Africa, the results actually get stronger. Convergence gets stronger, but it doesn't go away excluding any one part of the world. Okay. We're interested in the hypothesis that maybe this was driven by less frequent disasters. There were, you can think of disasters now, Venezuela or Zimbabwe, but they don't seem as common as they were before. And there were actually a lot of growth disasters in the 80s. And that's one of the reasons why convergence, growth disasters among poor countries. And that's one of the reasons why the 80s had this, it was an interruption in the general trend towards more convergence. But it's not like growth disasters are responsible for this whole pattern. It's also not that growth miracles are responsible for the whole pattern either. Okay. We'll go to the next slide. This also doesn't look like it's a matter of natural resource exports. We go on. One thing that we really just can't answer is this just a blip? I think Johnson and Papageorgiou or Danny Roderick had a piece in 2013, sort of saying, yes, there's been high growth, but not thinking that was real in some way. But I think at this point, the trend's been going on long enough that it becomes harder to argue with. And although we could have 25-year blips. It's possible if we think of this as a pattern of from multiple centuries of divergence. We should be careful about declaring that that's turned around. But the it doesn't. I think Broderick talked about commodity prices as part of this. It doesn't look like this is driven by resource commodity exporters necessarily either, with more time. It also, this is not driven by China and India. It's not driven by sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned. As I said, it's not just a slowdown in rich countries. I think we're going to, at least for the purposes of this paper, entertain the possibility that it really is a turning point in world history. And we'll think about really two, and we'll use this conditional convergence framework, and we'll think about two possible drivers. So one possible set of drivers would be faster convergence conditional on the correlates of income and growth. So conditional on human capital, on policies, on institutions and culture. Maybe we're just converging faster because of globalization. Basically, maybe it's now much easier for technology to flow across countries due to better communications. Maybe it's much easier to trade. Maybe people can just migrate much more easily. So that would be one possibility, that this is, and these aren't mutually inconsistent, could be some of each. Could be that we're converging faster, conditional on the correlates. The other possibility is that the correlates of income and growth themselves converged, so that policies became much more similar across countries and maybe moved in the direction of faster growth. And that could be due to the end of the Cold War and democratization, so maybe makes it harder to have really negative policies, a reduction in conflict across the world, and perhaps either the international institutions pushing Washington consensus policies, or just spread of ideas across countries. So let's see. Jack, are you taking over at this point, or do I keep going for a while?
You were going to go for like another 2 slides or so, Michael?
Great. Okay.
I'll just jump in.
Great. Sounds good. So let me discuss this. We can get evidence on whether the correlates of growth. We're going to discuss the convergence and the correlates of growth and income. So maybe we could go to the next slide. So there's this recent literature on culture and institutions that focuses on persistent effects. So, think about Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson, or Dell, or Lowe's, Nunn, Robinson, and Weigel. They focus on things, events in colonial history, things that go back, many centuries, and they show that that has a persistent impact. Now, I think that those empirical strategies, looking for historical instruments or regression discontinuities, by nature, that focuses on long-run persistent components of growth and emphasizes stability. And I think there's very interesting work showing the persistence of things like trust within the culture. So slave trade may have reduced trust, and that may have long-lasting effects, or setting up extractive institutions may make it hard to get away from it, or go to a different stream of literature. Maybe things like common law versus civil law are hard to change. And I think that, while all of this literature just says that there are persistent components, that can turn into a pessimistic view, that the determinants of growth are very deep-rooted and very hard to change. And but of course, there's not that, just because some components are persistent doesn't mean that they all are. So maybe we could go to the next slide. And what we find when we look at the growth regression literature is that many of the variables have changed substantially. And Jack, I guess, will take over and present most of that. We're going to divide things up into 4 categories. And obviously, like any division, this is not going to be perfect, but we're going to think about Solow fundamentals, but we'll think about an enhanced Solow model that has human capital in it. So the investment rate, the population growth rate, the years of education. Then we'll think about things that you might call policies. And a lot of the literature in the 90s was focusing on that. I've used tariffs as an example before, but also things like central bank independence. We'll put democracy and rule of law in there, although those obviously probably, those are somewhat slower moving, but they can still move over the periods that we're looking at. Then we'll think about really long-run correlates, for example, from this type of historical literature, legal origins of legal systems, settler mortality, geographic variables. And then finally, we'll add in some cultural variables, which may have deep-rooted components influencing them, but also could potentially change things like trust or individualism or avoiding uncertainty. Okay, should we go on?
Yeah, why don't I take over from here, Michael?
Perfect.
Great. Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks very much to Bill for inviting us and for the attendees. So part of our split here is that the long run correlates are correlates for which we don't have time variation. Okay, the other ones we have time variation, and so the first thing we're going to do is study the evolution of these three groups highlighted in red, and see what has happened to them over this same period in which we've seen this change in convergence in income. And so to study the evolution of the Solow fundamentals and short-run correlates, first of all, I'll talk about culture later. First of all, about Solow fundamentals and short-run correlates, we start from the list of such variables listed in Derloff and al.'s Growth Econometrics handbook chapter. Basically, they list all of the variables which have been used in well-known growth regression papers. And then we construct a panel of the variables which we can find, which are available for more than 50 countries since 1996. Essentially, throughout this empirical exercise, we have an issue in terms of trying to construct balanced panels. And so here we're trying to select variables for which we have a reasonably large sample. And we get 35 policy and institution variables, which we organize in the paper into 5 domains. So the enhanced Solow fundamentals, as Michael mentioned, then political institutions, things like Polity 2 score, governance quality, e.g. World Governance Indicators, rule of law scores, fiscal policy, things like taxes, government expenditure as a proportion of GDP, and then finance, central bank independence, inflation, and other such variables. There's a lot of empirical challenges here in this exercise and in the subsequent exercises in terms of, we're trying to get annual data on a lot of variables for a lot of countries, and countries become available, variables become available over time. So we have unbalanced panels of variables in very different units. And so we have to make some choices and some simplifying assumptions. So for the most part of analysis, we're going to start from 1985, just because that's a date at which lots of the data becomes available. That also happens to be the date in which the trend in income convergence changes. This is mainly to have a relatively inclusive balanced panel. In the secondary exercise, we go back to 1960 for many of the variables for which we can do this, but doing so results in fewer countries and more difficulty sort of balancing panels. The multi-correlate analysis is challenging, so it's not like we can regress income on all of these variables and have like a large panel of countries, just because different variables become available for different countries at different times. And so when we do multivariate analysis, we have to reduce the set of correlates and countries that we do it on quite substantially. We prioritize univariate analysis, doing things with one policy or institution variable at a time. We standardize correlates throughout by their variance in 1985. And so we want to make, when we compare across variables, we can think of a one standard deviation change in governance quality in terms of the 1985 distribution relative to a one standard deviation change in years of education relative to the 1985 distribution. This is just to make comparison across different correlates simpler. There's a lot of other econometric issues. Measurement errors might generate convergence through mean reversion. There's top coding of some of these variables. There's discreteness of a lot of these variables, making it hard to think about the notions of convergence. We do various things. We choose variables accordingly to try and minimize these issues. We also look at sigma convergence. So this is just, so what we initially presented was beta convergence, that is places with lower income growing faster. Sigma convergence would be, is this variance of income across countries decreasing over time? We also aggregate different correlates. Certain variables, like a lot of the world governance indicators variables, for instance, just when they're produced, the agency producing them normalizes them each year. And so for such variables, we obviously can't think about their convergence over time. We're going to use them in some of our exercises, but only when this normalization by year does not matter. Okay, so first result. So Solow fundamentals and short-run correlates have both improved in inverted commas and converged substantially over this time period, 1985 to 2015. So if you look at this table, so the variables in red are the enhanced Solow fundamentals. The variables in blue are just a selection of some important short-run correlates. So let's look at the first row, so years of schooling. So the first column being positive is telling you, well, in 1985, years of schooling was significantly correlated with income. Okay. The second column is telling us, well, between 1985 to 2015, on average, the average change in years of schooling is 0.86 standard in units of standard deviation of years of schooling across countries in 1985. And that's positive. This is something, and so we think that that's improved because the correlation between years of schooling and income is positive. So again, improved in inverted commas. What we mean is moved in the direction associated, correlated with larger income. And years of schooling has not converged. Okay, the third column, beta convergence, the convergence coefficient is minus 0.16, insignificant. So it's basically not converged. So human capital is a tricky one. Like if you look at primary schooling, you'd see convergence. If you look at tertiary schooling, you see divergence. Years of schooling is about flat. Looking across other variables, well, to summarize the findings, we find that 18 out of the 20 variables for which we can do this cross-time exercise, we find that they were highly correlated with income in 1985. And of these 18 variables, 15 improved significantly. Again, this means they moved on average in the direction associated with higher income in 1985. 17 out of these 20 variables converged significantly as well. And so they both improved and converged substantially. And there's large literatures in political science and sociology studying these trends. Like, why is it that there is policy convergence? What's driving that? So that was short-run institutions and Solow fundamentals. We do a limited similar analysis for culture. So just using World Value Surveys data. And so World Value Surveys has multiple panels. We can, for the variable, for many cultural variables are available in multiple panels, in multiple surveys. And so we can look at changes in these cultural variables over time. And so we examine perceptions, people's perceptions regarding trust, inequality, politics, family, the importance of work, religion, and traditions. This is a fairly limited exercise, but we choose 10 variables which we think are particularly important, and 8 of these 10 variables also converge at a sort of similar rate to what we were finding for the on average for the other variables. There's no convergence in trust and religion though. So even these variables, these cultural variables, which I think the modern institutions literature thinks of as very deep determinants of income, even these cultural variables have shown substantial convergence recently. So I said our main exercise is 1985 to today. we're obviously also interested in what happened before 1985, because that was when there was the change in the trend in income convergence. So we'd like to know if there was a change in correlate convergence and improvement at that time too. This is a much harder exercise because fewer correlates are available and for fewer countries. And so what we do have going back to 1960 are Solow fundamentals and a few of the short run correlates. So polity 2, government spending, share of private investment. But again, they're becoming available for more countries over time. So there's a balanced panel issue. I'll show you later some things we try to do with balanced panel issues. But here, if we're just essentially taking averages. So if we look at composite indices of these correlates, an index of a normalized index of what's happened to the Solow fundamentals and what's happened to the short run institutions, we see that that aggregate correlate score from this index has improved over time in both of them. So even in the 1960 to 1985 period, there's also been this gradual trend in improvements in these correlate scores. When it comes to convergence, so we see, so Solow fundamentals, there's no obvious trend over time in the convergence rate, whereas short-term institutions, again, this is a much less robust exercise because of these balanced panel issues, but see the convergence rate of short-run institutions seems to have sped up a lot around about 1980. So somewhat in line with the change in timing in the income convergence. This is okay. So we've seen these two changes. A change in the rate of convergence, or a trend towards convergence in income, and convergence in the correlates of growth and income. And so the natural question is, are these two changes related? And so we're not going to be able to do, perhaps unsurprisingly, a sort of full causal exercise here. Instead, we're going to revisit two cross-country relationships, so correlate-income relationships and growth-correlate relationships, and then tie these together to think about what's happened to conditional convergence versus absolute convergence. So obviously causality between income and correlates can run both ways. Modernization theory, as Michael mentioned at the beginning, would be of the view that as income improves, improved income leads to improved policies and institutions. So a classic example is richer countries are more likely to become democracies. Okay. The other directions is typically associated with growth regressions. So improvements in correlates, improvements in policies and institutions leads to improvements in or faster growth. So here there's a very long literature in economics. So for instance, the link between income to democracy and the link between democracy to growth have both been considered in papers by Daranis and Moglu, both directions of causation. So the most recent work that considers these relationships uses instrumental variables and other identification approaches. Instead, we're going to revisit and update two key cross-country relationships, as just mentioned, with the thinking that these cross-country relationships are, as a Bayesian updater, are useful things to know. And certainly when we're thinking about macro growth models, our models should be written to hopefully fit the cross-country stylized facts. Okay. I think this section is there's scope for much more work here. It'll be interesting in the discussion. It's also related to the work of Bill. And so yeah, so this is a sort of first stab from our part at looking at whether these two things are linked, but I think there's definitely scope for much more work here. So here's a simple empirical framework, how we're going to think about this. So linking convergence in income with convergence in its correlates. So the first regression is the unconditional convergence regression, which Michael started with. So growth rate regressed on growth level plus a time fixed effect, essentially. That's what we started with. Then we can think about correlate income relationships. So these are cross-country regressions, regressing correlates, or if you want to think about it as policies and institutions, on income. Okay, and if this would be a sort of cross-country representation of modernization theory. That is, income increases, does that lead to improved policies and institutions? And so that's our delta coefficient is the correlate income relationship. That's equation 2. Equation 3 is growth correlate relationships. So regressing growth on income, so controlling for baseline income, and then correlates, so policies and institutions, if you like, again with time fixed effects. So this regression 3 gives us two things actually. So the lambdas are the coefficients of growth regressions. The beta tilde is the conditional convergence estimate. And then, so we're going to look at what's happened, what's changed to delta, so the regression coefficient on income in 2, and also lambda, the regression coefficient on correlates in growth regressions. And then what's nice about setting it up this way is we can link what's happened to the gap between unconditional and conditional convergence. So if we do this one correlate at a time, one policy variable at a time, then we can just apply the univariate omitted variable bias formula, and it tells us that the gap between unconditional and conditional convergence, or if you like, the importance of conditioning, is just the product of these two slopes. So the correlate income slope and the growth correlate slope across countries. And again, so we're going to do this. Our principal analysis is going to be univariate, so one correlate at a time. Largely for these data issues, but I'll tell you some of what we do on the multivariate analysis as well. So now I'm going to walk you through what's happened to the correlate income relationships, what's happened to the growth correlate relationships, and then what's happened to the gap between conditional and unconditional convergence. In this exercise, we also consider long-run correlates of growth for which we don't have time variation. Okay, so as Michael mentioned, we have these different types of correlates: the Solow fundamentals, the short-run correlates, the long-run correlates. Culture, here we're adding back in the long-run correlates, because even though we don't have time variation in it, we can still see how we can still look into how these relationships have changed over time. So we're going to look at culture, historical institutions, geography. So culture here is different measures of culture from those in the world value surveys, historical institutions, geography, historical income. So first of all, the correlate income relationships, so regressing policies on income. These slopes, so the delta T, have remained relatively stable. So what's this plot? So this is a scatter plot. On the x-axis, it's telling you the correlate income slope in 1985 for a given correlate. And on the y-axis, it's telling you the correlate income slope in 2015 for the same correlate. So for instance, if you look at credit to private sector at the top, that was, if you regress credit to private sector on income in 85, it was 0.5. In 2015, it was 1. So these slopes on average have changed very little. So the black line fits the Solow fundamentals. Okay, it's the slope of this line is basically 0.9. The blue line fits the other short-run correlates, and you can see that in general these slopes have changed very little. The same result holds for culture and long-run correlates. So the cross-country correlate on income slopes have changed very little. Having said that, the levels of these relationships have changed quite a lot. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you take if you thought that the delta, the cross-country regression coefficient in 1985 was causal, and then you multiplied it by the average change in income at the country level from 2015 from 1985 to 2015, that does a pretty poor job in actually explaining the amount of change in any given correlate. So a mixed bag in terms of thinking of this for modernization theory. These cross-country relationships have remained very stable in slope, but on level they've changed a lot, and they don't explain, and these relationships don't explain too much of the changes in the correlates. Okay, now moving to the cross-country growth regression coefficients. So this is the same exercise, plotting the lambda, this time lambda in 1985 and against lambda in 2005 for different correlates or policy variables or institutions. So for instance, if you look at Barrow-Lee education variable, it's telling you that if you regress growth on the Barrow-Lee education variable controlling for income, then the coefficient was 1 in 1985 and is about 0.7 in 2005. This is on subsequent 10-year growth. So these coefficients are relatively stable for the Solow fundamentals. Okay, you can see that this fitted line has a slope of 0.86. All of the dots are pretty close to this fitted line. I mean, there's only three dots to be fair, but they're relatively stable. In comparison, other short-run correlates, so these are all of these other short-run correlates, there's almost no autocorrelation. That is, you fit the coefficient, you regress the coefficient in 2005 on the regression on the coefficient in 1985, and the slope of that line is 0.18. So there's very little autocorrelation on the coefficients for the other short-run correlates in growth regression. Long-run and cultural correlates are in between. So the slope of long-run correlates is this regression line in long-run correlates is 0.22. For culture, it looks much more successful. It's 0.63, much more stable. Okay. You can also see, it's not so obvious here, but there's a general flattening. There's a general shrinking in sort of the absolute size of these lambdas from 1985 to 2005. And then we can put those together because the gap between, by this omitted variable bias, the gap between conditional and unconditional convergence, the importance of conditioning, is given by the product of those two things. Okay. And so this is then this same plot again, but now plotting this gap between the unconditional and conditional convergence in this univariate exercise in 1985 versus 2005. And so if delta times lambda is positive, it tells us that conditioning on that variable increases convergence. If it's less than 0, it tells us that conditioning on that variable decreases the convergence rate. And again, you see that the effect of conditioning is relatively stable for Solow fundamentals, but there's been a general reduction in the effect of conditioning for other short-run and long-run correlates. And in particular, you can see a lot of these points are beneath the 45-degree line, which is telling us that unconditional convergence has trended towards conditional convergence. That is, the gap between unconditional and conditional convergence has shrunk. Okay. So that was presenting you results from 1985 to today, or to very recently. As I said, we might also be interested in what happened between 1960 to 1985, especially given that around about 1985 seemed to be when there was that trend break in the income convergence coefficient. So this exercise is going to plot delta t. So this is that correlate income slopes averaged across correlates from 1960 through to today. Now, why are these graphs, why do they have these multiple lines and why are they kind of ugly? Well, there's a lot of imbalance in this exercise. As I mentioned, when we go before 1985, the set of correlates available decreases and the set of countries for which those correlates available decreases as well. And so what each line is doing, you'll see the black line starts in 1960, the red line starts in 1970, for instance. Each line is holding constant the set of correlates and the set of countries for which it's considered. So each one is essentially a balanced panel exercise going forward. And you can see here as well, correlate income relationships have generally remained stable, somewhat decreasing, maybe, for instance, for culture, maybe a little bit for the Solow variables, but no obvious break in the trend pre-1985. We can do the same things with the growth regression coefficients. So again, this is just averaging growth regression coefficients across across different short run variables. For instance, would be this top right hand quarter regression. We see they're relatively stable for the Solow Solow fundamentals, have shrunk a lot for the short run variables. Okay, they were at their peak in, again, this is more speculative because of these balanced power issues, but they seem to have peaked arguably around sort of the late 70s, early 80s. Long run, similarly, we can see that these long run determinants, the growth regression coefficients on these have just become have just shrank over time. Culture, it's not quite clear. If anything, they've become sort of, recently they've become negatively, the regression coefficients on these have become, have flipped sign. But overall, we see a gradual trend since 1980 in line with just those 2 points in time that I showed you in the curves earlier. Before 1985, there's not a particularly obvious break in trend, but if anything, maybe these growth regression coefficients, for instance, were growing in the 1960 to 1980 period. If we look at that omitted variable bias, that is the gap between unconditional and conditional convergence, similar results to the growth regression coefficients. So Solow fundamentals drive the largest gap between absolute and conditional convergence. That gap remains relatively stable over time. Short run and long run correlates both seem to have peaked around 1980, and their importance for driving a gap between unconditional convergence and conditional convergence has since declined substantially. So as I mentioned, these results are univariate, that is including one correlate at a time. You might think, well, for instance, short run correlates might have become less important because what they really led to is improvements in the Solow fundamental. And so it's actually the improvements and so this is just to do with not including Solow fundamentals as controls. But these results look very similar if we include Solow fundamentals throughout as controls in these regressions. And this is just to say, so if I plot absolute convergence coefficients since 1960 through 2010, if we condition on all of the Solow fundamentals, the importance of conditioning on Solow fundamentals seems to have remained pretty constant throughout. Whereas, as I showed you before, at least in the univariate exercise, for other variables, the gap between these two has shrunk more recently. This is one of the many possible multivariate versions of this you can do. So this is showing absolute convergence versus conditional convergence since 1985, trying to include as many correlates in a multivariate exercise as possible for the conditioning. Here, you always face a trade-off between how many policies and institutions I include to control for, with how many countries I'm going to have data available for. And so we don't put too much emphasis on this approach just because there's, you have so much freedom as to how you select to do this. But we tend to find that the gap also in this multivariate analysis, the gap between absolute and conditional convergence has shrunk a lot over this time period. And so to conclude, so we've seen a trend towards income convergence since 1990, resulting in unconditional convergence since 2000, consistent with models of decreasing return to capital or of catch-up growth. Policies, institutions, and culture also converged over this time towards those of rich countries. And indeed, that seems to have gone back even earlier, since 1960s, although the convergence has arguably been faster since 1980. correlate income relationships remained largely stable, but growth regression coefficients, whilst they remained stable for Solow fundamentals, shrank substantially from the 1980s for short run and long run correlates of growth. And as a result, absolute convergence converged towards conditional convergence, just because the importance of conditioning on these other variables shrank, and conditional convergence held throughout. And so what changed? So it could be that there's, so as Michael alluded to, there's these two potential processes. It could be that there's been faster convergence conditional on correlates. So globalization, production of communication, of technology flows, of labor flows, or it could be convergence of correlates themselves, linked to the end of the Cold War democratization, Washington consensus. This second set of explanations has been our focus. I think the first set of explanations is super interesting. We just couldn't think of how to make much progress there. And this second set of explanations is very consistent. As Michael said, I think the whole paper is very consistent with Bill's 2019 NBR working paper on the role of the Washington consensus here. And so why did the growth regression coefficients shrink? So we saw these correlates improved, therefore absolute convergence, these correlates improved. We got income convergence, but the gap, it wasn't just that the conditional convergence got faster, it was that the gap between the two shrank because growth regression coefficient shrank. Well, one hypothesis is that there was earlier overfitting. So in the literature of the 80s and 90s, there's many possible things that you could include in a growth regression, and very limited data. So perhaps there was some overfitting with subsequent data acting as an out of sample test of sorts. That would certainly be consistent with the shrinking in the growth regression coefficients. Another hypothesis is that disastrous policies really hurt and are less important otherwise. So we did some very limited tests related to this, where we didn't find a lot of evidence, but I think Bill's paper is much more careful here and finds a nice story related to this. So hopefully we could discuss this more in the discussion. So our very speculative narrative is that there are many determinants of income. Some are observable, some are not. The observable ones are correlated with the unobservable ones. We saw rapid convergence, at least in the observable determinants, since the fall of the Soviet Union and the adoption of the Washington consensus. But growth regression coefficients shrank because the correlation between the observable and unobservable determinants fell, possibly endogenously. So if the 80s and 90s literature told you that certain variables were very important for growth, then maybe governments focused on those variables, and that reduced the correlation between those variables and other variables which are very important for growth. And so we think the paper gives cause for optimism in terms of now whilst it's slow, there does seem to be poor countries are in a sense catching up with richer countries, but it's also important to bear in mind that there are reasons not to be too sanguine. And so Rohini Pandey's discussion of this paper in the NBR macro annual, which is where it's published, noted that at the same time as this sort of trend towards a reduction in inequality across countries, there's been a contemporaneous rise in inequality within countries, and at the same time, there's been a recent trend towards autocracy, which could undo some of this convergence in policies, and also the potentially differential future impacts of climate change between developed and developing countries. So I will stop there. Thank you very much again for having us, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Jack. So we have some questions from the audience. The audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and I will read them to Michael and Jack. we have a bunch of questions already. Please send more. So Michael and Jack, I'm dying to ask you one big thing, which is this. This paper is interesting because of the big sort of methodological disputes in economics between identification on one hand and resolving causality on one side, and the other side that looks at macro stylized facts and macro correlations that are not causal. And of course, the causally identified estimates include randomized trials, and there's a lot of dispute about them, that they resolve causality, but the macro people are unhappy that they can't talk about their favorite macro topics from which they cannot resolve causality. And some of the more rigorous adherents to identified estimates would seem to feel that the macro correlations are useless. So each side seems to feel the other one is useless. And Michael, you're our only hope. You're the only one who's doing both. So come be the peacemaker, Michael, and say why you can
Okay.
that you think you can reconcile these two opposing viewpoints.
One thing in defense of doing this this type of cross-country data analysis, with which I talked about the origins of this paper, was updating the slides for my course. So I started the course with these facts there, with patterns of differences in income across countries, and so any theory that you have has to be consistent with the facts, just the basic descriptive facts. So that will provide some set of limitations on the possible theories that you can entertain. We may, I think Jack and Young and I all don't, we have, as reflected in Jack's conclusion, there are multiple stories that could be consistent with this. I don't think we can, point identify, as some people would say, the story here, but we can set identify perhaps and rule out some stories, like basic AK models would lead to divergence if there's any variation in A or in savings rates, for example, across countries. But I guess if I wanted to get broader, I think there's room for different types of techniques to be used in different questions. And then the final thing I would say is that, I think there's a lot of interesting, particularly in recent, randomized trial literature. I think there's a lot of things that get at underlying processes that have macroeconomic importance. So I'll just mention, two papers. One is work that Ted Miguel and I don't remember all of his co-authors, which is terrible, but did on looking at the generalized consequences of cash transfers. So these are $1,000 transfers to families in Kenya. They did this at these have been, people have looked at the effect of individual variation. This new paper tries to look at the effects of variation across regions and finds, and I don't want to claim this is dispositive, it's one paper, but finds evidence for pretty substantial multipliers. Or to take another example, I'll pick on a paper of Jack with Lorenzo Casaburi. Understanding determinants of consumption and insurance and risk bearing is of a lot of importance for macro, obviously. There's very low take up of a bunch of types of insurance. And Jack and Lorenzo showed the importance of that, showed that that's largely because available insurance contracts include an intertemporal transfer. You pay now for insurance against shocks in the next period, and that there's much more demand for insurance when you can, when it's pure insurance and you pay in the bad state of the world, you pay in the good state of the world to cover you in the bad state of the world. So those are examples. I could go on with a long list. Lapsupreet Kaur's work on labor. There's a lot of papers now that I think are helping get at some of the micro foundations that are important for a lot of macro models.
Jack, do you want to comment on this?
It's just interesting response. Like in some sense, like as a Bayesian, we presumably shouldn't put zero weight on such results. Like, of course, in like the microeconomists who are doing RCTs want to be answering sort of big questions as much as is possible. A macro exercise like this, you clearly shouldn't place zero weight on it. And I mean, another comment here is, well, two comments. People are going to be, especially at the policy level, thinking about such results, especially as, you know, in line with how Michael teaches, like graduate programs or even policy classes are often starting with these facts. Okay, and so these are forming like an important part of people's worldviews. And so we should at least get that right. And I guess one view of that is when these change, then the stylized factors held in both directions at some point. And so maybe this, in the past, people could had one worldview. They have the evidence in one direction. Now the evidence can help people who are arguing on both sides of that, whether policies matter or not, or whether poor countries are catching up or not. It's changed, and so you can't use that fact in just one side of the argument anymore, I guess.
So are both of you comfortable saying, on the basis of this paper, you could recommend policies and institutions that are good for growth and development?
I'm not sure about that, but let me just give an example of another setting in which this is important that I was thinking about earlier today. If you think about climate change negotiations, the position of a lot of low and the type of negotiation that the US would like to have is, well, how much should we cut our carbon levels relative to what we already have, and what we've emitted historically. Low-income countries often argue this is really unfair because you're basically then saying if you polluted a lot in the past, you're entitled to pollute more in the future. So how could you design a system that everybody would sign on to and that it would stick to dynamically over time? Well, if you think that the prediction for the future is likely to be convergence, and we don't know that, but you might be able to say, well, we could have some adjustment path where over time we do move to every individual in the world has a certain carbon budget, and that's equal across the world. But maybe realistically now, if we're looking for something that countries would sign up to, we have to have some differentiation based on historical factors, historical emission rates. So that's a type of policy that you might be more inclined to consider for climate change negotiations than if you thought that there was no convergence in the world.
Okay, that's a great example, but it sounds like you do have some hesitations recommending policies or institutions based on your findings.
I mean, if I were a policy, it's just the degree of confidence. I mean, policymakers have to act now, and people who are advising policymakers have to give them advice. So I'd be happy to throw out all sorts of opinions. If somebody asked me, I'd be happy to do that. But I would just be somewhat. I would try to also indicate that the degree of confidence that I have, and that in some ways this paper. You could read this paper saying we shouldn't be too overconfident. There are a bunch of things that seemed quite strongly empirically linked in the past and were linked, and are now where there's now a weaker link. So I think in general, I think we have a lot to learn in economics.
You're going to be an outlier on the levels of humility among recent Nobel Prize winners. Okay, let me read some questions from the audience.
Just one point on that.
Go ahead, Jack. Yeah,
so I guess trying to dig deeper into this. So related to Michael's last point. So we saw that a lot of these policies were pretty strongly correlated with growth in the 1980s, 1990s. They improved, and now they're not very correlated with growth. Does that mean that we don't know anything and we're in this? It was an overfitting world. The literature in the 1980s, 1990s was just overfitting, or does that mean there's this non-linearity story in terms of these things, like getting these things wrong really matters, and as long as you get them, and you need to get them right, and then great, you're going to converge, and it doesn't matter very much. More work on understanding that, and is related to your working paper, Bill, seems like a great place to make progress here. Like, are we in this world that we were just previously overfitting, or is it that getting these policies disastrously wrong really hurts? Otherwise, they're not that important. I think it's like something that hopefully people will work more.
And one other related point on that, which is what Jack was touching on the end, which is could be that there are many different policies. The policies we observe were very correlated with those policies before, with a whole host of other policies. Obviously, it's not just tariffs, it's all sorts of non-tariff barriers, but it's easier to measure the tariffs. Maybe now that correlation is just weaker, which would mean that there's some generalized version of the earlier story, which was true then and is true now, but the specific ways we've just gotten worse at our ability to measure.
All right, let me read some questions. Here's a question: does democracy encourage or hinder economic growth, or is there no correlation? And I know this also came up in the discussion on your paper by Asimoglu.
Jack, do you want to take that one?
Asimoglu and all have a recent paper, right? A JPE paper. I think that the title is something like "Democracy Does Cause Growth." So, who am I to argue? No, so we find the democracy coefficient does shrink a lot for us, since it's one of the coefficients which the growth regression coefficient on that shrinks a lot. Okay, so so our growth regression, so Darwin would say we should be doing a bunch of different things differently if we want to think of these growth regressions causally. One of them is include country fixed effects. Another is include a lot of lagged variables and do different instruments things. Okay, and I think we're using the growth regressions in part to try and explain what's happened in the absolute convergence. Okay, and so we're certainly not tied to a causal interpretation of our growth regression coefficients, and are very open to there being more sensible specifications there, like Darwin's specifications where you include country fixed effects and things. I think so. Darwin also thought we should include country fixed effects for our convergence results. We respectfully disagree there. I think in terms of that you're estimating something different when you do that, when you have a fixed effect per country in those convergence regressions. But certainly in the growth regression, regressions, it seems to us, or to me, a reasonable thing to do to include country fixed effects among other things. Their paper does a lot more complicated econometrics than what we do, and claims to find that democracy matters for growth. Our paper, when you do the simple growth regressions, finds that has shrunk a lot recently. Darwin's discussion, he said when he does their complicated things, you don't find that shrinking. So that's a summary of as far. I don't have a strong view, but yeah, that's to give you both our sides of the debate, I guess.
I would say we're not trying to. We weren't trying to write a paper about democracy or trade barriers or the influence of any of those things. We were trying to write a paper about why do countries now seem to be converging, and to the extent that one of the reasons they were converging was the adoption of democracy around the world. If you think that that's trend is going into reverse, and you think that democracies are causing growth, that would be or if you just care about democracy, those would, that would be reinforce the view that this might not be. Yes, we've seen this in the past 25 years, but we don't know whether it will persist. But I think there's debates either way about country, what you should do on country fixed effects. It's but I think if you put the country fixed effects in, then you'll just see the convergence showing up in another, the trend towards convergence showing up in those country fixed distribution of those country fixed effects rather than in the distribution of, rather than directly. So for the purposes of the question we were after.
So here's a question. Is it possible that part of what's going on here is the effect of data revisions, because there are periodically new vintages of data from the World Bank and the IMF and world tables and so on? Is it just that the data might have gotten better? That's the question from the audience.
I don't know, Jack, do you?
So the Patel and al. Paper, which Michael referenced at the beginning, which was by Justin Sandefur and Dev Patel and one other co-author, I believe, I'm forgetting the name, finds that there's been a lot less variance in country growth, especially in low-income countries recently, like at the same time as this increase in growth rates, and a lot more persistent growth. So you could say, well, maybe that's we might think, well, that's a reduction in disasters or an increase in stability. That might be related to sort of improvements in data collection or fewer revisions of GDP or something like this more recently. It's not clear to me why that would drive. We're averaging over 10-year growth rates. When you go down to if you do this at the year level, everything becomes noise essentially. But when you do it at 10-year rates, we're finding our results. And so it's not clear how these revisions, to me, would drive our results. I think it could partly explain those results in Patel and all, which say that there's a reduction in the variance of growth rates and increase in persistence of growth rates. But the actual convergence, I'm not sure of the story which would explain that.
This on the same topic by another audience member. How do you deal with poor numbers, especially for sub-Saharan Africa? But not limited to Africa, but there's a book, Morton Jervin, on poor numbers, how we're misled by African development statistics. How do you deal with that in this exercise? That's an audience question.
So first order to first order approximation, we don't. I guess we use the revisions of these. There were the most recently revised data, and so you could say, well, you might think, well, if there are revisions that are going to happen in of the recent last 5 years of data, then maybe we should ignore the last 5. Like if those revisions haven't yet happened, we should maybe ignore those 5 years of data. But I guess if we think of something like the growth regression coefficients, and we thought that there was a lot of measurement error in the correlate variables, so I guess that would attenuate our growth regression coefficients if we think of this as like a standard measurement error. And then, so I guess if measurement error has been reducing over time, if anything, that would go the other way of our results, right? That if developing countries statistical agencies have been improving over time and the measurement error has gone down, we would have expected to have seen, if anything, increasing growth regression coefficients, when actually what we've seen is decreasing growth regression coefficients. So I guess to sort of explain that trend, if we just think of this as measurement error, it would have to be that the measurement error has been getting larger over time.
Maybe I would just add on to that by saying, my impression is that there've been lots of improvements in welfare in low-income countries, including low-income countries in Africa, which have not shown up fully in GDP numbers, and that this is obviously that's true. That's true in high-income countries as well. But I think I would hazard that those effects are more important in low-income countries. I'm talking about things like improvements in health or increased education levels. If you think there's a consumption component to that, as well as an investment component, or increased access to communication. There's, I think, many more people now. Obviously, cell phones are a huge thing, but just access to television, for example, that won't show up fully in GDP, but it will. But I think welfare improvements have probably been even greater than. I think you'd see more convergence if we were looking at some sort of welfare measure.
It's even more optimistic. That's great.
Sorry?
That's even more optimistic. That's That's really a happy message. Okay. Okay, more on democracy from another audience member. There are plenty of countries that appear to be democracies on paper that are not really democratic, and the governments do not work to serve the public. How might those discrepancies show up in the analysis?
Go ahead, Jack.
So I don't know the details. So these democracy scores created by like Freedom House and others. So this is not like a score of governance quality which is reported by the government themselves. So I don't know the detail of how these scores are made, but I would hope that the sort of de facto level of democracy is taken into account in those scores. I guess again, in a sort of theoretical sense, you might think of this as measurement error, and then what has been happening to that measurement, what have been the trends in that measurement error. But I don't have Michael, you had something.
Oh no, I was just going to say that we basically use these quality scores. But I agree with Jack's latest point. I guess you could possibly tell a story where the measurement error got worse because in the old days there was a clearer division, and now there's maybe the measurement error got worse, and that might help account for reductions in coefficient on democracy.
I know. I remember in Daron's discussion, I think their preferred measure of democracy is slightly different from ours, and I don't know if this is related to these reasons. Like, obviously, trying to score a democracy is a non-trivial thing, and I think their main specification in that democracy does cause growth. Paper uses a slightly different democracy variable to us, but so I guess you could look at how these things, how robust this is to different measures of democracy as well.
Possibly you could run the convergence exercise separately for democracies and others. Could democracies be converging more to each other?
Yes, so we did an exercise. I'm trying to remember what the exercise. So we did an exercise by which we were thinking, well, maybe democracy is driving everything else, right? So, so we've seen these increases, these trends towards democracy, and until recently, maybe that's the sort of that's the key policy variable. After which, when you're in a democracy, there's the constraints on the executive lead you to not have these awful policy outcomes anymore. And so it's the sort of democracy, which is the key one, and all of this other convergence follows from that. And so we didn't get very far in terms of finding support for that argument, but it would be interesting to, as you say, Bill, also look within like a sort of a club convergence, as it were, within democracies versus outside of democracies. Do you have any other thoughts there, Michael?
No, I agree.
So here's a good question. How do you explain convergence and correlates? Was the Washington consensus right? was it agreed on by most countries? Did it really become a consensus?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the importance of, I don't think that Nehru set things up in India the way he did because he wanted to extract a lot of rents. I mean, I guess he's a human being. He probably had some motives like that, but I don't think that was the primary motive between for how India or Tanzania set up their institutions. And I think views changed, maybe for good reasons, maybe for other reasons. But I think that I think that these do have a real influence. If you're asking my personal opinion, not what I can prove, I think those have a real opinion on. That those have a real effect on policies, and I think I guess I would say, without saying the Washington consensus is perfect, I think it was an improvement on a lot of things that came before, and I think that I'm certainly willing to entertain the notion that was part of the reason for these shifts that we're seeing. I don't, and that's I don't see any contradiction between that and also believing that, for example, efforts to try to address income disparities are very important. I don't think having lots of state-owned enterprises was something that was actually reducing income disparities, or the way they were handled earlier, or contributing to economic growth. So I feel like to some extent the Washington consensus has gotten a bad name.
They shouldn't have called it the Washington consensus. The word Washington was the problem. Jack, did you have a comment on that?
So in terms of what drove this, so I think we'd say, so how do you explain the convergence in correlates? So the Washington consensus seems an important aspect of that. The other aspect, which we mentioned in the paper, it's related, is the fall of the Soviet Union, right? In terms of convergence in policies, and actually this in the data, this seems to do two things. One, you seem to see a lot of convergence in policy. I mean, the timing is not too dissimilar, so who knows? But you see to some extent convergence in policies in former countries which are formerly in the USSR, and two, you get actually sort of a direct effect on absolute convergence almost instantaneously, and that's because these new countries, sort of former Soviet countries, when they appear, they're sort of middle. They have low growth, and they're not, certainly not in the bottom of the income distribution, and so that immediately that has an effect on the unconditional convergence slope, as it were, but not, that's certainly not driving all of our results, but it has this effect on the spread of policy, but it also has this immediate effect, and now you just have new countries, which relatively high income but very low growth.
But I would also add another factor which related to the fall of the Soviet Union, which is the spread of democracy, in part because U.S. and Soviet Union would not necessarily keep backing dictators because they were on their side. And the Soviet Union ceased to exist in and the U.S. somewhat changed its policies, at least for a time, and that so increased democracies, and I think probably played an. I mean, again, I'm going beyond what I can. What we can say with the data, but my sense is that did play, and as Jack said, we looked for this and we didn't find, we could improve this with the data. But if you think about increased education in Africa, if you're trying to win a democratic election, promising to get rid of school fees is a way to appeal to voters. And following this introduction of democracy, there were often big efforts to expand primary education. I think those are probably linked, and I think the expansion of primary education will be good for growth. May already be being good for growth.
I was thinking while you were talking, if you probably didn't have data on the ex-communist countries when they were still communist, but if you had data, it would probably go in the direction you're finding. They had terrible policies by modern standards, and then they got better. Speaking of all the Eastern European and Soviet republics. Okay, here's another audience question. Did you look at the role of digitalization and technology, which have come of age in the period you analyze, on possible productivity growth, which would impact growth?
I think that's the other half that we just didn't explore in this paper, but I think that was because of time constraints, data constraints, and so on. But maybe we're just converging faster, conditional on any policies and institutions and culture, in part because of things like digitalization. That's certainly very plausible.
Yeah, it would be very seems to be a lot of potential work to do there. Like you could do a sort of a growth accounting exercise, as it were, and try and break this down and try and look at what's happened to the residual, for instance. Or there's a lot of papers which are, I guess, in between micro and macro papers now, like Jonas Short's paper on the arrival of fast internet in Africa, and he finds these large effects on employment, for instance, and other papers which look at the effect of cell phones and things like that, which would suggest that the arrival of technology has been important in increasing productivity growth. And so, yeah, as Michael said, that's the half which we think is super interesting as well, but we haven't really dug into. One way to look at this is to see what's happened to conditional convergence. Right? Again, conditional convergence is always tricky because there's so many potential correlates that you could throw in, and when you do so, you get a different panel, etc. But thinking about what's happened to conditional convergence over time and whether that's itself sped up or not would be one way to go there.
So, couldn't you have a technology term and see whether technologies are converging across countries? In what sense? But I guess in to test this hypothesis that digitalization matters, could you have included also something like internet users per 100,000 population and cell phones per population, et cetera, and those presumably were converging and maybe had some growth or income effect?
Yeah, seeing what's so as in the growth regressions, essentially throwing in those kind of measures of technology and seeing what's happened to those coefficients over time, and if we include them, what happens to the coefficients on other policies and the Solow fundamentals and things would be interesting.
Right.
I guess we could also. At first, I was thinking of looking at technology in the other sense of the residual and seeing if you construct measures of physical capital, human capital, then you can see what's happening to what the implied things, what the implied values of the residual are, and see if those are convergent.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess.
Yeah.
So I guess we should also go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say we should also say that that could be a part of, that could be another reason for which these correlates have converged, right? So one reason that policies might be converging more rapidly now is it's just much easier to communicate with other leaders. I know all sorts of reasons, like these same changes in technology, they could also have been part of the explanation for the convergence in correlates.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm thinking as you're talking also that you're presenting globalization as a pretty benign force, and obviously there's a lot of people who disagree with that see globalization as a problem and not a good thing. How do you think your paper influences that debate?
Well, I mean, this is a point that others have made before, but there's a view that inequality and poverty are increasing based on, at the same time as globalization is going on, based on looking within countries. But obviously, if you look at trends in world poverty, they're much more positive. And our paper is, you know, another angle of getting at that issue, that there's increasing inequality within countries, there's decreasing inequality across countries. And it was actually, I looked at that data as I was preparing the introduction to this year's class, and it was actually very striking because, you know, a few decades ago, inequality was overwhelmingly across countries rather than within countries. If you look now, there's a steadily decreasing inequality across countries and increasing inequality within countries. So it's still the case that I was looking at graphs, not computing the numbers. So this is sort of eyeballing, but inequality across countries, inequality within countries is getting more and more important, although it's still not as important as inequality across countries in overall world inequality. And that might have to do with globalization.
And you can tie this back to the convergence version of this as well, right? Where you're looking at averages rather than, say, poverty counts or something like this. So it used to be the fact that you would get club convergence or convergence across states within the US, for instance, or within the OECD and things, but you wouldn't get cross-country convergence. Now we're finding cross-country convergence. I should know this, but I think if you run the within convergence exercise, say within the US, you'll no longer have within US convergence. And so it used to be you'd have within the US convergence, a cross-country divergence, if anything. Now it's a cross-country convergence, and I believe I don't know this, but I believe it's within the US divergence. And so that's the average version of the inequality, which is a distributional takeoff.
Okay, that reaches the end of our audience questions. Do you guys have some last remarks you would like to say?
Okay. No, not on my side. Thanks very much. It was great to be able to talk about this.
Yeah,
I look forward to meeting in person.
Great to have you guys. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the audience, for all of you, for attending this event by the NYU Development Research Institute. It's really been a pleasure having Michael and Jack and all of you. Thanks very much.
Great, wonderful.
Bye.